Greetings, Sifters, and welcome to this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything right here on Sifted Games at Sifted.net. This show goes down because some of y'all are putting up your big pledges at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/sifted. You don't have to pledge $7 to watch this show. Everybody who pledges at least $4 or more per month gets to watch it on day one, but you do get advanced placement when asking questions if you're pledging at that higher tier, and in all honesty, this show doesn't happen if it's not for you, so thank you very, very much. Another week of Nintendo Switch 2 questions. I really thought after this week's Game Face that they might cool off. They have not. Let's get to the questions. Okay, our first question about Switch 2 comes from Squishy Muffin. Upon hearing that Matt hasn't taken his Switch out of the dock in years, it made me realize that players like him are technically getting a raw deal when buying a hybrid console. Especially now when the Switch 2 has an expensive high-end screen. Does it make any financial or logical sense for Nintendo to ever release a screenless Switch that's just a console, or a Switchless Switch? Just a box with the same internal components and the Pro Controller for Series S money around $300. Similar to PlayStation TV for Vita and PSP back in the day. This is a great question, Squishy Muffin, because there are so many layers to this. The first thing I will say is that a Switchless Switch is not a Switch. And if Nintendo takes away the ability to play it both as a console and a handheld, it loses its unique selling proposition. So then, people are only going to compare Switch 2 to the PlayStation 5, or whatever they end up calling the console-only version. They're going to compare that to the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. And let's be honest, that's not going to be a favorable comparison for Nintendo. However, as you point out, if you have that lower price point at $300, then expectations are reset a little bit and people don't expect quite as much. I think what you're getting at here is maybe Nintendo should consider lowering the barrier of entry to its first-party software. While Nintendo first-party games don't look quite as good as Sony's first-party games, or at this point really, Xbox's first-party games, it's the characters, it's the worlds that we've grown up with that we want to interact with, and in all honesty, they're just great games. Some people get caught up in the idea that Nintendo's games look like they're made for kids, and they do appeal to a wide range of audiences instead of just the 18 to 54-year-old male. Ultimately, their games are great. If you just swapped out the graphics for something a little older and edgy, it would still be a great game. So fundamentally, Nintendo makes great games. If you like their properties and their characters, then that's an added bonus. So lowering the barrier of entry to that stuff sounds like a really good idea. I feel like Nintendo would have to come up with an entirely different name for that device. It could not really have Switch in the title because it doesn't switch. So then there's a confusion of, okay, well, I have this other thing that's not called Switch, but it says it's compatible with Switch. It starts to get confusing. You may think that I'm being crazy about this, but don't forget that the average consumer never really figured out that the Wii U was a new console. Nintendo could do it, and I think it would do well with people like Matt or other older players who are kind of past the age of using a handheld. They're not going to school every day. They're not worried about sharing their Pokemon collections with their friends at school. There might be an audience for that $300 console with people like that, but if you told a kid, hey, we can't afford to get you a Switch 2 at $450, but we can afford to get you this other one at $300, and you'll still be able to play the games that all your friends are playing, just not outside the home. Some kids might be into that, but there is that whole thing of it's still not a Switch 2, and kids would be like, oh, you got the cheaper Switch, although I don't know if that really happened with the Switch Lite. I don't think Nintendo will do it. I guess I'll put it to you that way. Now look, it's not like Nintendo hasn't done stuff like this in the past, created like a cheaper version of its handhelds to sell to a bigger audience. Remember the 2DS? It almost looked like a speak and spell? Remember that? So there's precedent for this stuff. You also brought up how PlayStation did it with the Vita and the PSP, with PlayStation TV. And those basically were just precursors to Switch. Sony's actually been doing it longer than Nintendo, as far as that's concerned. So does it make financial sense for Nintendo? Probably. I think it could move some units. I don't know, maybe 10 to 20 million units, something like that, provided Switch 2 does well in general. Does it make any logical sense when you have a platform called Switch and you're introducing this other thing that actually doesn't switch? it could get muddy, and it could be a problem for consumers, and my guess is that Nintendo will look at that and say, we can't take any chances with that. So I do not think Nintendo will do something like this. Do I think it would do well if Nintendo did do it? Probably well enough to rationalize the R&D and setting up the production lines, but I don't think it would be a big seller. Okay, our next question comes from Nee, OJD. Is the idea of trying to make companies like Nintendo build factories in the US a losing one? We all like the thought of more US jobs, but we all hate the tariffs as well. What are your thoughts? Well, look, there are people out there that are far more well-versed in stuff like this than I am, and I'm sure you thought to yourself, hey, I could Google it if I want to, and I could read a story written by somebody who has basically built their entire career around writing about electronic manufacturing. So I'm sure there are better sources out there than I am. But I do know a good bit about this, but you don't really need to either, because here's the thing. Those factories won't create U.S. jobs. And I know that. The Republicans know that too. In fact, I think the guy that Trump has in charge of, I don't know if it's the financial side of the administration or if it's the tariffs, but he said it. He's like, there's all robot jobs. And if you want to get a job in these factories, you have to get a job fixing the robots. So that's the problem. You're right. We all want more U.S. jobs. We all want people in America to have high-paying, great jobs. I think every American can agree that is one thing we can all agree with. But I think where the X factor comes into play is like, how do you do it? And that is not the way to do it. Here's the other thing. Nobody wants a manufacturing job. People want jobs that pay well. If they have to do labor in a really hot warehouse to make good money, they'll do it. But good luck trying to find anybody who would rather do manual labor in a 100-degree warehouse all day than sit at a desk in air conditioning and send emails all day. Not many Americans are going to choose the labor job. That's just the truth of it. Some will, being stubborn or whatever, but most won't. These are not desirable jobs. But again, if you live in some of the more rural parts of America, you've got to take what you can get. I worked in a car carpet factory in Carlisle, PA called Maslin. And it taught me that I needed to go back to school and finish my degree. And I have a feeling a lot of people, if they got jobs in these factories, they'd be saying the same thing. I need to go someplace and get some sort of an education so I'm not working in this sweatshop. And there aren't going to be any jobs in those factories anyway. In 2018, PlayStation set up a factory that was 99% robots to build the PS4 Pro. And that's the way lines are now. They're all run by robots. It's all automated. And the only humans that work at these things are the people who watch the robots and fix them when they break. So, no. Building these factories in America are not going to bring more jobs to America. Some, but not very many. And the end result is that the cost of those goods is going to go up. If you can pay someone in China $1 an hour to build something, even if you build the plant in America and you're using the same number of employees as that plant in China, those Americans are not going to work for $1 an hour. So no matter what, the price of that good is going to go up and it's going to be more expensive. So look, the people throwing around like, let's bring manufacturing back to it, it's nonsense. Nobody wants it. American workers don't want it. Nobody wants to work in a hot mill if they can have a job sitting in an office space somewhere in air conditioning. And that's what we have. Pachter mentioned this in the latest episode. We have intellectual value. We can do jobs that require our minds instead of our hands, and it frees us up. We can buy all the cheap crap from China and all these other places, and it frees us up to do bigger things. That, to me, is what makes America great. So, yeah, it sounds like a great idea, and you're right. All Americans want other Americans to have great jobs. At least I hope that's the case, but this is not the way to do it, unfortunately. Next up, we have a question from Kool-Aid. Before the advent of disc-based media, video games used to be a much more expensive hobby, certainly one where most gamers didn't have the ability to play every major release. If the industry continues to contract, do you think the games market will revert back to being a more niche, boutique experience? Where do you see the direction of single-player games going if their prices go upwards of $100? Well, Kool-Aid, I'll say this. I think we have a while before they're going to go over $100. I'm feeling pretty confident at this point that Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to be $90 or $100. And I wouldn't be surprised if they do what Pachter mentioned and give you like $40 of in-game currency for GTA Online, so it doesn't seem like you're paying that much for a game. I think we're a ways away from most games being $100 or more. Even Nintendo, I think you're only going to see the $80 price point for like its big time marquee games. Zelda, Mario, stuff like that. Animal Crossing, probably. I don't think every Nintendo game is going to be $80 either, so I think we're still a ways away from kind of what you're talking about. But more to your point, with the market contracting and things like that, what's going to happen in single player games? I think you're going to get less single player games. What we're seeing right now is going to continue to happen because the risks are too big. So you're going to get less single player games and you're going to get less risky single player games. So most of the games you're going to get are going to be sequels of franchises that the publishers know you already like and you're at least going to give a chance to. You're going to see less risky ideas, less risky products. You're going to have to really start searching for that stuff among the indie games. And I think that's probably what will happen more than anything is you'll start to see the line between indie games and big budget games start to blur a little bit. And certainly, as far as creativity is concerned, I think you're going to see all of that shifting towards the cheaper indie products and not the big AAA, whatever, big budget single player games that we've been playing for the last 20 or 30 years or whatever. So to your point, like, people forget how much we've paid for games in the past. We've been kind of lulled into this false sense of security where people either don't remember the past, never knew the past, or don't care about the past. Over time, people forget stuff or just conveniently don't want to remember it or care about it anymore. And that has happened with video game pricing. A lot of people right now who are mad about Switch 2 weren't buying games in the NES, the Super Nintendo, the N64 era, where we were paying $70, $80, $90 for a game. They started, most of them, or a lot of them, in the PlayStation 1 era where games were $50 because, as you mentioned, they were on discs. So it's frustrating to watch people just ignore history and act like this is some crazy precedent that's shaken the foundations of the industry. I get that Nintendo increasing the prices, most people believe that that gives license for everybody else to increase prices, but again, it hasn't increased in like 30 years. Like, it's like we've been floating along. It's kind of like squatters, I guess, who float along living in this house for free for months and months, and nobody knows they're in there. And then one day the owners show up, and then the cops show up, and then it's all over with. And that feels like kind of what's happening here with the Nintendo Switch 2 pricing. Okay, our last question for this week's show comes from Erebus Jones. You've taken news of the increased cost of both the Switch 2 console and games quite well. Better than many, myself included. If you were a private citizen who didn't need them for work, where would your red line be? What's the number Nintendo could push that price to before you say, I'm not paying that? I kind of hinted about this in the last question, but I feel a lot of this is just about perception. My perception is that the Switch 2 hardware is worth as much money as the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X hardware. All you're getting with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X is the hardware to run the games. With the Switch 2, you're getting the hardware to run the games, you're getting an awesome screen, you're getting motion-controlled controllers, you're getting a lot more than you're getting with other consoles. And truth be told, Switch 2's price is still reasonable compared to those other consoles. It's still cheaper. And again, going back to expectations, I feel like people, because the first Switch launched at $300 8 years ago, people are just like, well, it's just going to be the same. That's not how life works. It's also a much better device than the first Switch relative to when it is coming out, as far as how old the tech is compared to when the actual console is coming out. I think a lot of it is just perception. People perceive Nintendo as the console for kiddie games. All its games are for kids, so that means they must be cheaper because it's a toy. This is all perception and not reality. Look at PS5 and Xbox Series X. You're paying more for those. You can't take them anywhere. You can take your Switch anywhere. And I get some people like Matt don't undock. I don't hardly play my Switch in handheld mode either. But it's still added value. Even if you never use it, it's still potential value sitting there that you just have not utilized yet. So there is more value in a Nintendo Switch 2 than there is in a PlayStation 5 or there is in an Xbox Series X, and it costs less. Again, I think it's all about perception. Your perception is that your kids play the Switch. You should be able to buy that cheaper for your kids. For a lot of people, that's not the way it is. There are people my age that just love Nintendo and Switch is their primary console. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. So it is all about perception. People perceive Nintendo, it should be cheaper. It's for kids. You can go through the components of Switch 2 and you can see that Nintendo is not gouging people on this console. So I personally do not feel slighted or ripped off spending $450 for a Switch 2. I think it's worth that amount of money. I do not have a problem spending $80 for a game that I am literally going to play for like 300 hours. All I'm doing is sharing my experiences. I do like Mario Kart. I do like multiplayer Mario Kart. I will play it for 300 hours. I do not think that the Switch 2 is overpriced when you look at what's actually inside the console and the added value of being able to take it on the road. So that's where I'm coming from. That's just how I feel. I've been doing this a long time. I've seen every Nintendo console come and go. I've seen every console come and go. And I'm just telling you, this does not strike me as overly expensive or exorbitant or Nintendo trying to squeeze people. I think it's a fair price. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, that's it for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything. Hopefully, the last one that's basically dedicated 100% to Switch 2. I'll just say I added an extra question in this week's episode, hoping that we'll get over the hump and we get some questions on some other stuff for next week's episode. If you do want to ask questions for this show, go to SIFTD.net. In the header there, there's a link that'll take you to our forums where you can ask me questions about whatever you want. Big thanks to the people who are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/sifted. I'm just saying right now, you're the reason that this show happens, and I appreciate you guys very much. Obviously, I love all our patrons. If you'd like to become one, as I said, go to patreon.com/sifted. $4 a month gets you all our content, day and date. We'd really appreciate it. So have yourselves a great week, and we'll see you for Game Face on Tuesday.